Welcome to everyone. Good morning to our viewers in the US. Good afternoon to our viewers in Europe and beyond. I'm happy to welcome quite a number of international participants today from the US and Germany, of course, but beyond Germany, within Europe, also from Finland, from France, from Poland, and if I'm not mistaken, even one participant from Japan. And that is, I think, a 14-hour time difference to Japan. I know you didn't need to jump on a plane to come to Washington, D.C. to join us for our event, but thank you so much for your efforts to join us anyway. Arigato gozaimashita. The Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, or in English, the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation, is a German institution with civic education centers all around Germany and more than 100 offices worldwide. And we host regularly, all around the year, all around the world, international seminars, workshops, conferences, international events about politics, about international affairs, of course, also about transatlantic relations, about our close partnership between Germany and Europe and US and Canada. Yet, unfortunately, due to COVID-19, we had to cancel most of our events, of our regular events, not only here in the United States of America, but also in Europe. Thanks to YouTube and Zoom, we would like to, of course, stay in touch with you. And today we would like to take the opportunity to shed some light on some aspects, important principles and rules of the US electoral system. In the US, in other words, to explain the US electoral system, especially, of course, to our international participants, because not every interested observer, and I know all around the world people are following the campaign, following what is going on in the US right now, but not all international observers are actually knowledgeable on how elections in the US are conducted. Just to give you 3 examples for what is different compared to elections, for example, in my home country, in Germany. In Germany, on election day, you vote in every federal state on a Sunday from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. You always vote here in the US, you always vote on a Tuesday, but the time at the polling places are open are set by the US states. Secondly, in Germany, you have a local registration office. We call it Einwohnermeldeamt or Bürgeramt, typical German words, of course, not only in every city, but in every precinct, in various parts of every city. And you have to register in these registration offices when you move, for instance. As a result, everyone, once you turn 18, everyone is automatically registered as a voter in this precinct. This is important because here in the US, as a voter, you have to register separately. Thirdly, absentee voting is very common in my home country, in Germany, and the rules are clear-cut. Here in the US, again, you have different rules in the US states, in the various US states. In order to better understand the US electoral system, I'm happy to welcome 2 panelists. And I would like to at least briefly introduce them, although they would deserve, of course, a much longer introduction, but due to our time constraints, I'll keep it crisp and brief. Firstly, Soren Dayton. He is a policy advocate for Protect Democracy. Protect Democracy is a non-partisan, non-profit organization based here in Washington, D.C. Soren was most recently a senior vice president at Hill Knowlton Strategies. Prior to that, Soren worked for communications and digital agencies, Senator John McCain's campaign for president, and a rule of law development NGO in India, not the oldest democracy worldwide, but the biggest democracy worldwide. Soren also worked with a number of political campaigns, including campaigns for the US Senate and for chairman of the Republican National Committee. He is on the board of advisors of Tech Congress and was a Penn Campbell Fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy. Soren, thank you so much for joining us. Last but not least, Frank Sensenbrenner. He is a quantitative risk manager. He has worked in bank risk modeling, at the Northern Trust Corporation and as a senior management consultant at Deloitte. In the same time, he has also been a fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies for 4 years. His research has been published in a number of academic and practitioner journals, as well as conventional media outlets. Frank is here with us in his private capacity, not only because he knows a lot about the US, and I really benefited from his insights during the last 2.5 years of my stay here in the US, and I really appreciate all the talks we've had so far, but also he knows so much about Europe. He has long been active in foreign policy circles like the German Atlantic Brücke and the Swiss American Foundation. Frank, happy to have you with us today. I will first have a few questions from my side to Søren and Frank. After that, I will hand it over to my colleague Jan Bösche, who is following the chat room. So for our Zoom participants, if you do have questions to Søren and Frank, please post them in the chat room, and we hope to get back to you to as many questions as possible later on during the event. In order to kick it off, I would like to address my first question to Søren, kind of a softball question, but important, of course. The election takes place here in the US on November 3rd. In contrast to countries like Germany, this is not a Sunday, but a Tuesday, as I've mentioned at the beginning. General elections in the US always take place on a Tuesday. Where does this come from, and why is it like that? Sorry.
Well, this is something that there's actually a fair amount of debate about changing, because it seems a little irrational. And indeed it is. Like I think you're going to discover during this conversation, many of the ways we hold elections in the United States is really, contingencies based on history. In this case, in the first half of the 19th century, we had a little bit of a debate about normalizing when we held elections, because actually prior to that, even presidential elections were held on different days. And so Congress ended up passing a law that said that the election would be held on the first Tuesday after the first Monday. So it can't be November 1st. It has to be at least November 2nd. And why Tuesday, as Paul said? Well, at the time, the Brits held elections on Thursdays. And so you couldn't do that. And Sunday was occupied by church. And polling locations sometimes required travel to get there. So it couldn't be a Monday or a Friday. And so you were left with Tuesday or Wednesday. And we picked Tuesday. And I think the lesson, again, you're going to hear again and again and again, some of our decisions are based on things that were done 100 more years ago and don't entirely make sense in today's world. But in many ways, that's the way the symbols and rituals of our politics often work.
Thank you so much. Perhaps one follow-up question. Voter turnout in the US compared to Germany is a little bit lower, is a little bit less, usually at least. Is that kind of related to the fact that the election takes place on a regular working day?
Election turnout has gone up and down. In many ways, the peak of turnout was in the 1920s, which was long after the Tuesday was picked. There have been suggestions to either make the day a national holiday, and many employers this year are giving the day off or giving time off for working, or to move it to a weekend or something similar. I don't think you can attribute turnout issues to that. I will also say that over the last several years, elections have moved more and more to early voting, which I think we'll probably talk about earlier. People can now vote in person today in Virginia, for example. Voting in Virginia started on Monday, and anyone can show up at a local election office and vote between now and November 3rd. So it's a little bit more complicated and textured.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's move on to Frank. Frank, before we, as I mentioned at the beginning, before we had to cancel our visiting programs, our events in the US in March, mid-March, roughly in mid-March, I had a chance and a pleasure to host a small visiting program in South Carolina and in Texas, in Houston. And in Houston, I had, on the occasion of the primaries, and in Houston, I had a chance to have a look at the ballot. And I was quite impressed compared to, let's say, for example, in Germany, there were so many, let's say, positions, so many candidates, so many questions the voters had to decide upon. Getting back to November 3rd election, who is actually on the ballot? Who do people have to vote for, or who could people have to vote for? It is not just, let's say, Congress. It is not just third of Senate seats. Who else is on the ballot? Frank, go ahead.
So I'd like to underscore Soren's point that a lot of what we see is historical, and a lot of this is due to the United States notion as a federal state. Now, we'll see people all up and down on the ballot. So we'll see federal officers. A third of senators are up each year. Every U.S. House member. We'll see some local officials. Governors are elected every 4 years. State senators, state representatives, mayors, city council members. But this is where things get a bit interesting. Back in the 1870s to the 1900s, known as the Progressive Period, a number of states thought there was too much power in either corporations or in the central government. So they started these things called propositions, which we see in California, for example. So in California, if you get enough signatures, you can put an issue on the ballot. So an issue about tax or an issue about social issues. And these issues tend to be used to encourage turnout of a specific side. Now, two examples people may have heard of in California are back in the 1970s, there was Proposition 13 that capped property taxes in California. And recently there was Proposition 8 in California, which is whether California recognized marriage only between a man and a woman. Here in Illinois, we have an amendment to the state constitution on tax rates. So you'll see parties jockeying and putting these issues on ballots to try to turn out their base. In addition, you can get very granular. One issue you see in many places is whether voters even approve of the issuance of a school board or a city government issuing bonds. And you get the normal debate of whether the school system needs more resources versus whether this is too much debt to have. And so many of these issues are state-based. The laws governing whether you get these issues onto a ballot are state-based, ballot access rules. So one of the reasons that candidates sometimes struggle to get on the ballot, as you've seen even recently with Kanye West's insurgent run, is that in some states he did not have enough signatures to be recognized for the ballot. So each state says you must have enough signatures of domestic voters, voters within that state, to be accepted for the ballot. And they check those signatures, they make sure all of them are valid, and if you miss the threshold, even by one signature, you will not make the ballot, and you must run as a write-in candidate. So critics have said the system does hurt independent candidates or growing third parties. And you look at, say, the rise of the AfD or the recent rise of the Greens, and these sort of rules may have hurt the growth of these parties if they were in place in Germany. Another difference with Europe is in many states, the role of judge, usually in states in the South, and sheriff are elected positions, as well as tax officials. Like here in Cook County, we have the tax assessor who decides how much each house is assessed for property tax. In most European countries, those are nonpartisan civil service roles. In many U.S. places, these are politically elected and partisan roles. So I've discussed the strategy of putting controversial issues on the ballot to motivate one side. And one last thing we see that we might want to touch on more when we talk about voter turnout is that the United States uses these things called voter files, which are data that can help a party predict who a voter might vote for. So they use political data, whether you've volunteered or whether you've been active with the party, and they even merge it with consumer data. So like car ownership, that can help you predict what party might be supported. So if a campaign believes you're statistically likely to vote for them, they may remind you to vote, not even knowing if you're certain to vote for their candidate, but they can say maybe with a 70% confidence level that you'll vote for their candidate. So when you hear the discussion about voter turnout that parties focus on, this is really what we're going on, and plays into Soren's point on early voting, that each party is focused on getting people they think either are pledged to them or people who are statistically likely to them to show up and vote. And again, the earlier the better, because then you know they voted, they can't change their mind. So we'll hear a lot of talk about that in voter turnout. Thanks.
If I can give two of my favorite examples of the local election officials. In Louisiana, coroner, the person who certifies that someone is dead, is an elected official. And there have been some brilliant TV ads about sort of Frankenstein kind of things in the coroner's office. And in Florida, the mosquito control districts are elected, where you have obviously mosquito problems in Florida, and the bug sprayer lobby essentially has a lock on these seats. And when there's fights over budget for how much the government should spend on mosquito control, they often put those on the ballot. I've even had a local pool, like a debt issuance for a local pool a couple of blocks away from my house, on the ballot. So these are enormously complicated. In 2018, Texas ballot, I was trying to explain to someone in Europe how complicated this was, had 105 questions in Texas in Houston, between ballot initiatives, offices, et cetera. It's truly insane.
So the ballot was pages, basically.
Into the 20s, yeah.
Yeah, and just be clear for our audience, both the question on who is actually on the ballot, as well as, for example, how many signatures you would have, for example, to put, is different from state to state.
And from county to county and city to city.
Thank you so much. Third question, and this is already getting back to some of the issues we've touched upon already, but this is something which is, I cannot emphasize it strongly enough, is the election is often called, also in Germany or in Europe, it's often called presidential election. Yet the president is actually not elected directly by popular vote, but by the Electoral College. How does the Electoral College actually work? Who is the members of the Electoral College? What majority is required in the Electoral College, and what kind of time frames are legally binding for the Electoral College to come to a decision? Perhaps we start again with Frank, and then Soren, you might add.
Okay, well, the Electoral College is set in the Constitution, and each state legislature sets the rules for the election. Uniquely, DC has electors, but none of the other U.S. territories like Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands have electors. At the time of the U.S. founding, this was sort of a balance between North and South. There was a debate about the popular vote, and people brought up different populations at the time. So the Electoral College was a way to balance Northern and Southern power at the time. States are all winner take all. So if you win a plurality of the vote, you get all the Electoral College votes, except for Nebraska and Maine, which break up into congressional districts, and they give votes based upon congressional districts that each candidate wins, and 2 to the winner of the state. So I think last time Trump won the Maine 1st congressional district, so he got 1 vote out of Maine, and the other congressional district people look at is the Omaha district in Nebraska, which is seen by some as a swing district. So again, this is all state-based, so you have 2 states which are outliers. Historically, political parties put forth candidates for electors, and you usually see this in party primary ballots. So when I voted in the primary back here in Illinois, each of the Democratic primary candidates had a slate of electors. If they had been the Democratic nominee, these would have been the individuals from my state of Illinois who would be the electors if the Democratic candidate won Illinois. So the electors can do ballot in the state and then transmit the vote to D.C., to the president of the Senate, who tends to be the vice president of the United States. There is a joint session of Congress to count the electoral votes and to certify or raise objections. And votes have only been rejected twice. In post-Reconstruction America, where there were a lot of rotten borough problems in states in the South. There were two states, one Louisiana in 1864 and I think Tennessee in 1872, where the electoral votes have been historically rejected. You need 270 votes for a majority and to be elected president and to be elected vice president. Given that this is 2020 and all sorts of strange things have happened that have never happened before, we should think about what happens if no candidate has 270 electoral votes. If that's the case, the Senate elects a vice president. The Senate must choose from the top two vote getters from vice president. The House elects a president from the top three vote getters for president, and each state delegation has one vote. So all the Congress people from Kentucky must agree, or win on plurality who gets there. So it's not one seat, one vote, it's one state, one vote. And if there's still a deadlock by Inauguration Day, whoever the Senate has elected as the vice president-elect becomes president until this can be resolved. Thanks.
Thank you. Soren, I mean, that leads directly to the question of why parties are paying so much attention to swing states or battleground states or toss-up states, because the number or the members of each state in the Electoral College is of course different according to how many seats the respective state has in Congress, plus 2 senators. I leave out the District of Columbia because that's a little bit different, but this is basically the reason why the campaign, why the parties pay so much attention to these crucial swing states in order to get the 270 vote majority, necessary vote majority, correct?
Yeah, and often those swing states end up representing a couple of different sociological patterns. So in this election, the swing states really come from 2 places. One is the upper Midwest Rust Belt, or the Midwest Rust Belt, and I put Pennsylvania in that category, although it's on the East Coast. It's sort of very similar in a lot of ways. States tend to be older, had a more industrial base. Many countries are losing their industrial base, have a pretty substantial working class population connected to that industrial base, but are also going through enormous changes with the rise of sort of middle and upper middle class information workers, things like that. Then you have out west a set of swing states, and I should say that includes Pennsylvania, to a lesser extent Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, maybe Minnesota. And then out west you have states that are quite different, that are where there's a lot of racial dynamics, much larger Latino populations, different economies, much less industrial, much more agriculture and service work. And so the election often comes down to sort of a story for these 2 parts of America. But what this means is the president doesn't go to California, neither party would go to California, would campaign in California, even though it's the largest state, even though it's the 5th largest economy in the world. All you can do is raise money there because everybody knows how California is going to vote. Now, people do campaign for the congressional seats, for other things, because it's enormously important what happens in California for the national economy. But mostly California and New York are just about fundraising. One of the interesting questions in this election is to what extent that will be the case for Texas, which is historically, or for the last 30, 40 years, been a Republican state. But the rise of 2 factors that I just mentioned, more and more Latinos, and the suburbs going more and more Democratic, make Texas, and potentially for different reasons or for adjacent reasons, Georgia, all of a sudden states that matter. So you're seeing a lot of resources be flooded into those states.
Yeah, and Frank already mentioned the winner takes it all component.
I was just in Maine for vacation, and you can, you're in one part of Maine, and then you drive into another part, and all of the Trump and Biden signs disappear as you cross across the border, because no one, one of the districts is an urban center, and one is the sort of great vast forest land of northern Maine. And so it was just wild seeing one place where people are contesting the election and then literally going, a couple more miles down the road, and nobody cares.
Yeah, and I'm Frank. I'm often asked from people interested in what is going on in the U.S. from Europe, from Germany, why is it actually always two parties dominating the elections, the Republicans and the Democrats? Why is it so difficult, let's say, for third parties, fourth parties to be more prominent in these elections? You've mentioned already the ballot laws, but let's say the winner takes it all rule for most of the US states when it comes to the Electoral College. Does it also play a role why you always have these two dominating parties?
Yes, and historically, if you look at U.S. third parties, the only successful ones have tended to be breakaways when a governor has become disenchanted with his party. I think of Walter Hickel in Alaska, who started the Alaska Independence Party, and Lowell Weicker, who started the American Party in Connecticut. Both were elected as Republican governors, and then they had philosophical differences with the party, started their own parties, and due to essentially these parties being artifacts of personality, as well as the fundraising base too. I mean, these parties have been on the ballot, but if they don't have rich donors, it becomes increasingly hard to compete in an environment where lots of money is spent on reaching people through the television and now increasingly through social media. So I would say ballot access, fundraising, and I mean, we talk about branding. Branding matters. We know what the two major parties stand for right now in the United States. And I think in the German context, people have a good assumption of the policy set each party stands for. You set up a third party, and I think there's a great deal of debate and uncertainty as to if that party was put in power, what policies they pursue.
Yeah. Last week we had an online event talking about the role of millennials and Gen Z and the role of minorities and actually the share of these groups for the electorate. And I learned from our distinguished panelists that especially when it comes to young people, more and more young people neither identify themselves as Republicans nor as Democrats, but more and more, especially young people, if I'm not mistaken, understand themselves as independents. So how does that play into let's say the election scenario, Soren?
So one aspect of that is simply people feel less and less served by either major party, or less and less connected to either major party, and they are not. They're still registered to vote, but it's worth stepping back and addressing what the registered to vote means, and what party identification means with respect to that. So, I live in Washington, D.C. I'm a registered Republican in Washington, D.C. When I go and vote in a primary, I have to say I'm a Republican. I can only actually get a Republican ballot. Now, where Frank lives in Illinois, they don't have party registration. So Frank can walk in to a polling place and say, give me the Republican ballot or give me the Democratic ballot. And so when we say people are independents, what we mean in one technical sense is that when they go to register to vote, they are not affiliating with any party or any of the major parties, is typically what we mean. Here in Washington, we have a statehood Green Party, for example. We would still think of that as a sort of independent for this purpose. Then there's this question of who you identify with, right? Which is, I think, more what a European might think of as sort of someone thinks of themselves as something, but may not be a dues-paying member of a party. That's sort of more what you're asking. And what I think we see when we find out that Americans are less and less affiliating with party, and again, this does have the generational dynamic you suggested, is that they're feeling less and less served or less and less connected to the parties in some way. And one consequence of that is when you mobilize, if you're thinking like a campaign person, you have to mobilize either through different institutions or find other ways of connecting with those voters. You can't just say, hi, I'm from the party. This is what we think. Here, you should go do this. So it creates much more complicated situations. And as Frank mentioned, the voter file, you start using all these other data to figure out how to motivate someone.
Yeah, but since you've mentioned it already, how does registration, actually work? I learned here in Washington, D.C., I think it was in Washington, D.C., you can actually register for elections in the Department of Motor Vehicles.
Yes. This is the 1993 Motor Voter Bill that actually made registration easier by tying it to when you register for a driver's license. So there's a couple of different ways to answer this question, and there's sort of cross-cutting factors here. So one way to think about this is, you have a list of eligible voters at certain locations, and that list contains their name, their birthday, their address, maybe what party they're with, etc. And so you have to identify, you have to affirmatively register in most states, not every state, again, because this is, the many states of America that may or may not be united. But in Washington, D.C., you have to register. Now, recently, there's been a shift towards what has been called either automatic or automated voter registration. So when you turn 18 in New Jersey right now, or Alabama, two very different states, you are automatically registered to vote. Now, one of the questions has been, what party do you register with? Which goes to your question, if you're automatically being registered in New Jersey, they have to register you as non-party affiliated, because otherwise they would be pushing you into one. Now, there's another challenge here, which is some states don't allow either current felons to vote or people who had been felons. So if you've committed a crime of a certain level, you may not either be able to vote at all, or you may have to go through some hurdles. And Florida a couple of years ago passed a ballot initiative that said that their law that said felons could no longer register to vote they repealed that. And there's been some court battles and things like that to work out the mechanics of this. In Virginia, you actually need a pardon from the governor if you've been a felon to vote, which the governors routinely give. So there's other challenges here. But the key parts there are registering is an affirmative thing that you have to do, although in the 90s we made it easier by tying it to driver's licenses. Two, there is an attempt to automate that whole process or to make it sort of more automatic, but there's still some interesting restrictions mostly around felons.
Thank you so much. One last question perhaps to Frank before we kind of open the floor, or I hand it over to Jan for question from the audience. The issue, we touched upon the issue already about absentee voting and voting by mail. That's also different from state to state. There's states where you get all the necessary documents automatically. There's states where you have to apply for getting these documents to vote by mail. Can you elaborate on that, Frank?
Yes, so back to our theme, it's, again, different by state. In some states, as Soren mentioned, there's early voting. You vote as you normally would on election day. You just go to your polling place within a certain period. Normally, states either have a certain date for early voting, or you can vote up until a window before the election to allow them time to process. So let's say until 20 days before the from 40 to 20 days before the election, you can show up at your polling place and early vote. But again, different by state, not available in every state. There is then absentee balloting. which is voting by a ballot using mail and having a witness. Historically, some states, and some still do, require an excuse, like you're out of state due to travel, or you're having a medical procedure, or you're a student at an out-of-state university. Two major states that still require excuses for an absentee ballot is New York and Texas to vote this way. And historically, you also need to request this. They're not sending you a ballot in the mail. You have to say, I would like an absentee ballot. I do not plan on showing up and voting in some states. So this is my excuse. Now with vote by mail, due to COVID, in some states you still have to request, but in others will send the ballot to you automatically. In California and New Jersey, among the states, 9 other states in 2020, you will get a ballot to vote by mail. And there have also been rules in the past with absentee balloting about when the ballot has to be received to be counted. Usually it's you have to get it, the election office has to receive the ballot by when the polls close on election day. However, in 2020, a number of judges in Wisconsin and in Michigan have ruled that so long as the ballot is postmarked by election day, it will be counted. So it will get postmarked, it will take a number of days to be sent through the mail to the election office, and then it will be counted. So that could take several days. So in tight elections in Wisconsin and Michigan, we may not know the winner on voting night.
Thank you so much.
And if I can add a little bit to the local flavor on this, there are some states that have a long, reasonably well-run history of absentee ballots. So, for example, in Florida, many voters, typically 40% of the voters, vote by absentee, and they have administrative processes that are designed for that. So in fact, 22 days out from the election, so that is, early October, they can start processing the ballots. They come in the mail in an envelope, and they check everything, and they take them out and they put them to be ready to scan. But in other states like Pennsylvania, they can't start opening the envelopes until polls close on November 3rd. So we are going to have radically different time frames in their ability to count. We could very well know the results of the Florida election because they know how to count absentee ballots in an effective way by the November 3rd or November 4th. I don't think anyone thinks we're going to know the results from Pennsylvania for a couple of weeks because they don't have the apparatus. In fact, they just moved to a no excuse absentee system. Frank described that some states you need an excuse, some states you don't. They just moved to that. And if you'd asked an election administrator professional what the worst case for the 2020 election was, if you asked them last year, not in the time of COVID, they would have said, we're not sure Pennsylvania can do this. Well, now you've added COVID, now you've added more ballots, all sorts of things. So the election administration in each different location is going to have really different behavior in how the results are counted and how we experience whether it's election day, election week, or election month, in the sense of processing the results and both as sort of seeing the numbers, but then also understanding as a polity who our elected officials are for the next 2 and 4 years.
Thank you so much. In order to understand election dynamics, you need to learn about the electoral system. That's what we've learned already. I'd now like to hand it over to my colleague Jan Bösche, because as I said at the beginning, he's following the chat room. And Jan, any further questions from your side or from our participants?
Oh yeah, we have a lot of questions, and most of them came in when you talked about voter registration and how that works. And for instance, I would try to bundle them a little. One thing, Søren, was kind of a clarification. You talked about the Republican ballot. So the question is, are there different ballots, or is this just a thing for the primaries? And another question fitting with that is, how does this work to register as a voter with a party? Does that mean that you're only allowed to vote Republican or a Democrat? And the other question perhaps I can put on top of this is, why does not every state just register automatically? Why do you have it by yourself in many states? What's the advantage or the disadvantage of that?
Yeah, so thank you for asking me the clarifying question. The party registration is primarily for purposes of determining what primary you can vote in. And in some states, you can only vote in the primary if you are a registered member of that party. In other states, if you are not registered with a party, you can vote in any primary. So in New Hampshire, if you're not affiliated, you can vote in the Democratic primary or the Republican primary. But in DC, you can't. You have to be a member of a party. In California, it actually differs by party. Only Republicans can vote in the Republican primary, but independents can vote in the Democratic primary. It's just, again, it's a very, all these things break out like that. Now, no, so when I say Republican ballot, that means, again, using Frank in Illinois as an example, where a state that doesn't have party registration, Frank, when he goes in to vote in a primary, he has to say, I'm either going to vote in the Republican primary or the Democratic primary. Right. And so that's what I mean by the Republican ballot. You can obviously vote for whoever you want in any case. Now the question of automatic or automated voter registration, I would say this is something that's emerging. It was not something we did for a variety of reasons. There aren't actually great databases of all the Americans and all the people in a certain state. And just because you have a driver's license in a state may not mean that's where you would vote. If you're someone with two houses or something like that, you could make decisions about that. But this is something that's becoming more and more normal. I mean, I mentioned New Jersey recently adopted automatic voter registration. So has Ohio, so has Alabama. And there actually ends up being a fair amount of bipartisan support for that. That doesn't mean it's automatic. It means you have to go on a state-by-state basis. There's not that much Congress can actually regulate about elections. In the Constitution, it says Congress can regulate the time, manner, and place of elections for Congress and president. They can't do it for state and local elections. And who is an eligible voter is entirely a state issue. So Congress can't actually say, Congress can't tell a state, this is what it means to be an eligible voter. That is not constitutional in our framework.
Yeah,
I would add that.
Yeah, Frank, go ahead, please.
I would add that this is a major difference between the United States and many other countries. Like you look at Canada or Germany, where there's a federal administration of elections for many offices. We have it by the Constitution by state, and the Federal Election Commission is mostly focused on issues of campaign financing. So they really can't get involved in these things. And that's why you see issues like the butterfly ballot that, if you recall from the election of George W. Bush, this was created at the local level. So again, we have this federalism issue, and things will be very different everywhere else in the world. I would just also add on Soren's point that one of the reasons behind this Republican or Democratic ballot is that there's been concerns by parties that if you have a race where one candidate who's competing in the primary may be perceived to be totally unelectable, people from the other party would vote in that party's primary so that their candidate could go up against the weakest candidate of the other party. So that's why these parties have created rules in California, or the states have created rules to prevent this sort of manipulation of the electoral system. Thanks.
I would add one other thing, that in many cases, local election officials, typically county or municipal election officials, are elected or party affiliated in many cases. So, for example, in Iowa, an important state, the county auditor is the official that runs local elections, and that is an elected person with a partisan affiliation. Now, in, I would say, 99% of cases, those are very responsible, neutral officials. They understand that their job is to run an election successfully. But one way in which the United States is an extraordinary outlier And there are several ways in which the United States is an outlier, but one of the ways in which the United States is an outlier is that it's actually partisan officials that run the election in, almost every case. There are a couple of important exceptions, but this is not a situation where, like India, where you have an electoral commission that sort of flies around the country and manages the election. This is done at the local level, often by partisan officials.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate, Søren, by the way, that you mentioned already twice, and I should have mentioned that, of course, from my side, that Frank is actually based in Chicago, Illinois, just to make that clear. That's very, very important, of course. Sorry.
And I'm from Chicago, so I think about it. I grew up there.
I didn't know that. Yeah. Any further questions from the audience?
Yes, we have a couple of questions about voting by mail. One basic question is, how high is the percentage in normal election years without a big pandemic? Another question is, why do you need an excuse in many states? Why can't you just do it on a regular basis? And another question is perhaps a more political one. Why is there this fight about this question about voting by mail in this year? The president has his opinion, Democrats have other opinions. So why is this such a hot topic?
Who would like to start? Søren?
I'm happy to. So first of all, voting by mail. Again, this is a state level issue. Some states, Utah, Oregon, typically states out west, have 100% vote by mail, in the sense that all the ballots are sent out to registered individuals, and then they can return them either by mail, or they have these drop boxes. You can go, if you still want an election day experience of going to your polling place, you can take your ballot and put it in a box. And as Frank mentioned, a number of states have added, have decided to send all their ballots out. Some are particularly confusing. So Georgia, in the primary, sent ballots to everyone, or no, sent applications to everyone so that they could vote by absentee. But in the general election, you have to request a ballot. It's just very confusing. And one of the challenges with this election is going to be what individual voters are comfortable doing and used to doing will impact the behavior. Now, some people just don't want to vote by mail. The organization I'm with has done focus groups. And there are really two parts of the American population right now that don't trust voting by mail. One is African Americans. And what you hear is that sometimes they have less faith in the various components of government working for them. So they actually want the emotional reality of putting the ballot in, the ballot box. And so you have found historically just much lower participation in vote by mail of various sorts by African Americans. Similarly, partially as a consequence of the discussion around this year, Republicans who had been the primary users of mail voting have come to be less trustful for it. I vividly remember in 2005, a Republican National Committee meeting in which the political director for the Republican National Committee said absentee ballots were the thing that were going to give the Republicans an incredible advantage years on out. And so these are things that sort of come and go based on trust. Now, why do states require excuses? To some extent, it's just sort of default attitudes towards how easy certain kind of voting can be. There have been some legitimate questions about fraud, I would say. In East Chicago, which is in the just adjacent to the city of Chicago, in Indiana, not too far from Frank, there was a very famous Democratic primary in 2003, where 32 people were convicted, or 31 people were arrested, one died, or 32 were arrested, 31 were convicted, and one died in jail of cheating with absentee ballots with elderly people. And so this is something that can be true, but it's, so there have been systems built around these in some cases to do this. Some of the states Frank mentioned, Texas and New York, that have had restrictions, some of them, like Massachusetts and Connecticut, actually don't allow no excuse absentee ballots in their constitution. Now, the way Massachusetts got around it is they just said it wasn't absentee ballots, it was mail ballots. No meaningful distinction, but they just changed the words around it. So this is just sort of how the systems have emerged, what the underlying political processes. Jan, I'm sorry, I missed the last question. Can you remind me of it?
I think you pretty much answered it.
Okay, there we go.
But I would have a follow-up question. I mean, you've mentioned Oregon earlier on. We talked about why U.S. general election are happening on a Tuesday, which is partly due to history and so on and so on. But there's also a component of, let's say, huge distances in the US. I mean, to travel from one place to, let's say, to cast your ballot in some ballot office in some areas, and as you said, you mentioned Oregon, that's quite a distance. So do we have, is let's say, absentee voting or voting by mail accepted, does it find a stronger acceptance in, let's say, rural areas compared to metropolitan areas? Is there any proportional, let's say?
I think there is an element of that. The places that have had higher degrees of vote by mail tend to be out west, Oregon, California, Utah, Washington, Arizona. Some of that is geography. Some of that is a lot of it's driven by older voters. But I think in many ways, Frank mentioned the progressive era of the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. A lot of these reforms are actually sort of connected to ideas that came out of the progressive era about making access to things easier. And the progressive movement was really, it had one form in the east of the United States, which was substantially about sort of putting experts in charge of government. In the West, it was actually a much more populist agenda that made things like the ballot initiatives that Frank mentioned and absentee balloting easier to participate. So every American could participate more fully, excuse me.
Thank you. We have 5 more minutes. Frank, you'll get the next question from our audience. Jan, please go ahead.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm still with you, of course. Yes, the next question is perhaps very interesting from a European perspective. Why swing states are undecided? What is the pattern amongst them? Why are these states the ones they're undecided? And perhaps I can add another one. Is there an official commission that validates results on a federal level, or is this just handled on the state level?
Okay, Frank, go ahead.
So to answer the first question, the Electoral College votes are first validated on a state level by each state and then transmitted to the joint session of Congress. That's House and Senate. And they are the ones who accept these votes. Now, in 2000, some people raised challenges to the votes that came in due to the disputed election. And Al Gore, in his capacity as president of the Senate, which the vice president occupied, rejected those challenges, even though he'd be in their favor. They'd be to his benefit. So the joint session of Congress, presided over the vice president, is the federal institution that validates the Electoral College votes. And the last, why swing states are undecided. Well, going back to Soren's point about how we're seeing two different groups, we're seeing the Rust Belt we're seeing out west, and then we're also seeing some of these Sun Belt states with changing demographics and more information workers, like in North Carolina or Arizona, coming from bluer states like New York or California. Most U.S. elections are both defined by swing states and swing demographics. And if you look at the polling among college-educated workers, that is where each candidate, I've seen polls which show Trump in the lead, I've seen polls that show Biden in the lead, but they're both in the lead by like 2 or 3 points among this demographic. So these are the areas where this demographic tends to push people across the line. And that demographic is genuinely, from the polls, pretty undecided about the election. They see certain arguments on each side that they might agree with, but they also see arguments they disagree with. But since Soren is also more on sort of the pointy end of this, I think he would probably have a better answer for that.
Soren? Well, I will say when you look at the various demographics, you see real shifts in society tracking our economy and things like that. So in the 80s, college-educated voters were overwhelmingly Republican, and there were sort of class associations with that. There were economic associations with that. And now that is shifting, as these are people that are now information workers. And I think, when you look at Europe, you see a similar dynamic where maybe the rise of the sort of urban green parties, reflect a different educated base. And when you look at the sort of creative class workers in large companies, I used to work for Hill & Knowlton, which is part of WPP, which was then, maybe still is, the world's largest advertising conglomerate. And in the time of Mad Men, advertisers were Republicans. Now they're sort of creative class people who are overwhelmingly left, either center left or farther left for the most part. And so you can, as society shifts, people don't necessarily, they tend to stand still in some sense, especially once you hit sort of the kind of ages that we all are, although Paul has moved more than us in some ways, right? Where people move to a place for for a certain set of jobs and family situations, and they stay there. And as new industries pop up, people move. So I think that's really what's going on. There's very few swing states that have been swing states for a very long time. I would really put Ohio and Florida in that list. And both of those have the sort of mix of things that have been changing America in all sorts of ways. You've seen the decline of Cleveland, you've seen the rise of small manufacturers, et cetera. So, all of these things come together to tell your story of who's in play in America.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, friends, we are running out of time. I'm sure Jan and our participants do have many more questions. Please bear with us that we have not been able to answer all your questions during this event. During the last 60 minutes, we could, of course, only touch upon some basic aspects or some basic important aspects of the US electoral system. Before we leave the meeting, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to both our panelists, Soren and Frank. It has been a pleasure. I've learned a lot. I'm sure our audience has learned a lot. Thank you so much also to our participants, both in the US as well as in other countries in Europe and beyond. I hope we could explain or at least help to better understand the US electoral system. We will host our next online event on Wednesday next week. Please join us again. For now, from Washington, goodbye and stay safe. Thank you so much.